It was just another late night in the city, and I was heading home after a long shift. The subway platform was almost deserted, just a couple of people scattered at opposite ends. The distant hum of an approaching train echoed through the tunnels, and I felt a small wave of relief. The train screeched to a stop, and I stepped into a car that was mostly empty, except for a man sitting in the far corner. He was slouched, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap, and wearing a bulky coat that seemed too heavy for the mild evening. I sat near the doors, keeping my distance, and put my headphones on, pretending to scroll through my phone. The train pulled away from the station, its rhythmic clatter filling the silence. As the train moved through the dark tunnels, I started to notice something. Every time I glanced up, the man seemed to be watching me. His face was tilted just enough that I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't fully see them. I told myself it was nothing, maybe he was just zoning out, but the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable I felt. When the train stopped at the next station, no one got on or off. The doors slid shut and we were moving again. That's when he stood up. My stomach tightened as I watched him slowly make his way down the aisle, his movements deliberate. He stopped a few feet away and sat directly across from me. I tried to act natural, keeping my eyes glued to my phone, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. "You shouldn't ride the train this late," he said suddenly. His voice was low and gravelly, and it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't respond, pretending not to hear him. "You hear me?" he asked, louder this time. I nodded slightly, hoping that would be enough to make him stop talking. But he didn't. "Dangerous people out here," he continued, leaning forward. "You never know who you're sitting across from." My heart started pounding. I glanced at the map above the doors, counting the stops until I could get off. "You don't talk much, huh?" he said, his lips curling into a smirk. I shook my head, praying the train would move faster. Then he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out something small and shiny. My breath caught in my throat. It was a pocket knife. He flipped it open, the blade catching the fluorescent light as he started fiddling with it, running his thumb along the edge. "Bet you've never been in a real bad situation," he said, almost casually, like we were having a normal conversation. I forced myself to stay calm, gripping my bag tightly. "I don't want any trouble," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. He laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble?" The train slowed as it approached the next station. I stood up, ready to bolt the moment the doors opened. But so did he. "You getting off here?" he asked, his tone mockingly polite. I didn't answer. The doors opened and I darted out, my pulse racing. He followed. The platform was completely empty. I glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, but it was just us. "Hey!" he called out, his footsteps echoing as he came closer. I started walking faster, heading toward the stairs. "You're being rude," he said, his voice growing louder. I broke into a run, my sneakers slapping against the concrete. I didn't look back, but I could hear him chasing me, his footsteps growing closer and closer. As I reached the stairs, I tripped, my knees slamming against the edge of a step. Pain shot through my leg, but I scrambled to my feet, clutching the handrail. I heard him laughing behind me. "Nowhere to go," he taunted. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, I spotted a transit worker standing near the turnstiles. "Help!" I screamed, waving frantically. The man stopped in his tracks, his grin fading. Without a word, he turned and sprinted back down the platform, disappearing into the shadows. The transit worker ran over, asking if I was okay. I could barely get the words out, my entire body shaking. The police were called, but they didn't find him. They told me he probably slipped onto another train or out a service door. I've ridden the subway countless times since then, but I never sit in an empty car anymore. And I always keep an eye on who gets on, because you never know when someone might decide you're their target. It was late, just past midnight, and the platform was nearly deserted. I had stayed at a friend's place longer than I should have, and now I was regretting it. The subway station was one of those older ones, with flickering lights and cracked tiles. The only sounds were the distant rumble of trains and the occasional drip of water somewhere in the tunnels. I sat on a cold metal bench, scrolling on my phone, trying to ignore how alone I felt. There were only two other people on the platform, a man in a tattered coat pacing back and forth near the edge, and a woman sitting at the far end, her face hidden under a large hood. I kept my head down, not wanting to make eye contact with anyone. But out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the pacing man had stopped walking. He was standing perfectly still, facing the tracks. And he was staring at me. I pretended not to notice, keeping my eyes glued to my phone, but my hands started to shake. The train wasn't due for another 10 minutes. I silently cursed the delay, wishing I'd called for an Uber instead. When I glanced up again, he was closer, still staring. My heart started pounding. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just another eccentric New Yorker, harmless but weird. I'd seen plenty of them on the subway before. But then he started walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I stood up quickly, gripping my bag tightly. I considered moving to the other side of the platform, but I didn't want to look scared. "Hey," he said, his voice raspy and low. I didn't respond. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said louder, his pace quickening. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting toward the hooded woman at the other end of the platform. "Excuse me," I called out to her, desperate for some kind of backup. She didn't move. The man stopped a few feet away from me, his head tilting to the side like he was studying me. "You look familiar," he said, grinning. His teeth were yellow and his eyes were bloodshot. "I don't think so," I said, my voice trembling. "Oh, I know you," he said, stepping closer. "Yeah, I've seen you before." My pulse was racing now. I turned and started walking briskly toward the other end of the platform, hoping the hooded woman would notice and intervene. But as I got closer to her, my stomach dropped. Her hood had slipped back slightly, revealing her face, or rather what was left of it. Her eyes were open, unblinking, her skin pale and waxy. She wasn't moving at all. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Something wrong?" the man asked from behind me. I spun around to see him grinning wider, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets. "What do you want?" I shouted, the words echoing in the empty station. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled something out of his pocket, a knife. I bolted without thinking, running toward the stairs. My feet pounded against the concrete as I climbed, my lungs burning. But just as I reached the top, I froze. The hooded woman was standing there, blocking the exit. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her dead, glassy eyes were fixed on me. I turned back, only to see the man at the bottom of the stairs, his knife glinting in the dim light. "You can't leave," he said, his voice echoing through the tunnel. I pressed myself against the wall, shaking, my mind racing for a way out. That's when the train roared into the station below, its headlights illuminating the platform. The man turned toward the noise, distracted for just a moment. I didn't think. I just ran, darting past him and onto the train as the doors slid open. As the train pulled away, I looked out the window, my breath fogging the glass. The man stood on the platform, staring after me. But the hooded woman, she was inside the train car, sitting a few seats away, her lifeless eyes locked on mine. When the train pulled into the next station, I bolted off and didn't stop running until I was on the street, surrounded by people and lights. I never took the subway late at night again. And sometimes, when I'm walking alone, I swear I can feel someone watching me, waiting for the right moment to reappear. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and I was sitting on the subway platform at Union Square, waiting for the uptown train. The city was quieter than usual, the kind of eerie stillness that makes you feel like you're being watched. The train screeched to a stop, and I stepped into the nearly empty car. There were only a few passengers scattered around. A man in a hoodie slumped in the corner, a woman scrolling on her phone, and an older guy nodding off near the doors. I sat in the middle of the car, clutching my bag tightly. The doors closed with their usual hiss, and the train lurched forward, the lights flickering as it picked up speed. After a few stops, the woman and the older man got off, leaving just me and the guy in the hoodie. I tried not to stare, but something about him felt off. He wasn't looking at his phone, reading, or doing anything most subway riders do to pass the time. He just sat there, head down, shoulders hunched, motionless. I told myself not to overthink it. Weird people are a part of New York life. Still, I moved to the other side of the car, closer to the door. As the train rattled through the tunnels, I noticed he was sitting up straighter, his head tilted slightly toward me. My stomach twisted, and I told myself to stay calm. Then he stood up. His movements were deliberate, slow but purposeful, and he started walking down the aisle toward me. "Hey," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Got the time?" I glanced at my watch. Almost midnight. "You shouldn't be out this late," he said, taking another step closer. His tone sent a chill down my spine. Too casual, too rehearsed. "I'm fine, thanks," I replied, trying to sound confident. He was only a few feet away now, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his hoodie. I could see his eyes glinting under the flickering lights. The train slowed as it approached the next station. I stood up quickly, pretending this was my stop. But when the doors opened, he stepped in front of me, blocking the exit. "Where you headed?" he asked, a smirk curling on his lips. "Excuse me," I said, trying to push past him. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a grip like steel. "Not so fast." Panic surged through me. I yanked my arm back, but he held on tight, his nails digging into my skin. "Let me go!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty car. He reached into his pocket, and my blood ran cold. I didn't see the knife, but I could feel it pressing against my ribs. "Don't scream," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. The doors started to close, and I did the only thing I could think of. I stomped hard on his foot with all my strength. He howled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to slip free. I bolted out the door as it began to close, nearly tripping onto the platform. But he wasn't done. The knife glinted in his hand as he slammed against the door, trying to force it open. I ran toward the station exit, my legs feeling like they were moving through quicksand. Behind me, I could hear him pounding on the doors, screaming something I couldn't make out over the roaring of the train pulling away. I burst up the stairs and onto the street, gasping for air. The lights of a bodega a block away felt like salvation, and I sprinted toward it. When I finally reached the safety of the store, I collapsed against the counter, shouting for help. The clerk called the police while I tried to catch my breath, my whole body shaking. By the time they arrived, there was no sign of the guy. They told me it wasn't the first time someone had reported a similar incident on the late train. That night, I promised myself I'd never ride the subway alone again after dark. The thing that still haunts me, though, is the look in his eyes, the calm, predatory stare. I was lucky to get away, but I can't stop wondering what would have happened if I hadn't.